Namaste. I am Dr. Seema Bhaduri. I have been Professor of English at the senior college level for the last 3 decades and more. One of the issues that have concerned me most is that of identity. The identity of the Indian individual. Why Indian? Because obviously we Indians would be different in so many ways from the people in the rest of the world. And the identity of the Indian individual today is a complex issue. It relates to the issue of modernity, our modernity. We call ourselves modern, we call ourselves individuals. I'm speaking in English with you here. English is a Western language. And we all admit that we have been very strongly influenced by Western modernism. Our individuality is a direct outcome of the effect of Western modernism upon our culture. In fact, our modernity originates in Western influence. And yet we are different from the Western in so many respects. So we have a complex identity. We follow Western norms, Western manners, Western food habits, Western dress codes, and Western ways of thought. We celebrate Western festivals, and yet we are traditional as well. We celebrate so many traditional festivals. We follow so many myths. We believe in myths. We abide by the family system. We all have some kind of faith or the other. So in this way, we are a mixture of Western and Indian influence. The question now before the individual is that where does he stand? Mentally, spiritually, culturally. Is he a blind imitator of the West and a blind imitator of Indian tradition? Perhaps yes. Because unless he understands the Western traditions that he is following and the Indian traditions as well, unless he has selected the traditions for himself, he is an imitator. And to that extent, he remains colonized. Then how may he be modern? Modernity is not to be confused with contemporaneity. The contemporary is not necessarily modern. The modern instinct appears in every age. It appears in the individual who questions the traditions he has been following, who questions the influences upon him, who wonders to what extent they are right, to what extent they are relevant or they are meaningful. And then after understanding them, he chooses, he selects what he thinks he should believe, how he thinks he should live, what his opinions, his perceptions should be. Only such an individual has the right to call himself modern. And it becomes necessary for almost everyone to understand his roots in this way, so that he can totally move, he can truly move towards freedom. Freedom from influence, freedom from the colonizing hold of other nations, other countries, other cultures, or even of his own traditions. Now, this book of mine, A Dynamic Modernity, treats of this particular issue. This book looks at 6 very prominent Indian novelists writing in Bengali, Hindi and Indian English, who have looked at the issue of the Indian individual's cultural background from different angles, who have probed the issue of individuality in the Indian context. And what I feel and what I found is that their investigation has been very, very profound, very self-revealing, and I have learned quite a lot from it, and I want to share it with you. The first novel that I have taken up is by Dhurjiti Prasad Mukhopadhyay, written in 1935. The name of the novel is Antarshila. But before I go on into this, I shall revert to the issue of the Indian individual. Individualism in India is a product of Western influence, Western thought. Traditional Indian culture did not support individualism. We were a collective people. We were known by our family, our race, our community, our ancestors. The individual as such was not supported in the Indian community life. It was only with British education, with exposure to a different world, that Indian thinkers started questioning their traditions, and thus was individualism born. Let me tell you, individualism lies at the core of modernity. You cannot be modern unless you are an individual. But then these individuals face several problems. The problem was the conflict between the ancient Indian traditions rooted in orthodoxy, rooted in ancient superstitions, rooted in mythology, lots of backwardness. That was one. And the other was the Western influence. The Western world was very, very attractive, but it had many dangers. Because the Indian found in the Western world the greed for money, the greed for power, the increasing hold of technology, of industrialization, the increasing imperialism, the destruction of nature, the loss of faith, the denial in the existence of a higher power whom we call God. So the Indian individuals were not sure whether to accept Western influence as it was. This was the problem before them. In order to express themselves, in order to express their doubts and their anguish at the present position, they were looking for a narrative mode, a proper method of narration in which they would be able to express their problems. The Indian narrative systems did not allow at that point for such kind of a writing. So they imitated, they adapted the Western stream of consciousness narrative mode to express themselves. This new narrative method, which came up in Britain in the 1920s, was taken up by individuals there in Britain who faced similar problems. Europe had given up its medieval past since the Renaissance, the 15th and the 16th centuries. God was forbidden, the existence of God was denied. So once the existence of God was denied, everything that went along with the idea of God, that is heaven and hell, sin and virtue, morality, right and wrong, good and evil, all these things collapsed. An entire culture collapsed. What came up in its place was the emphasis exclusively on the individual and his rationalism and his reason. It was said that reason can solve all the problems of the world. So reason, along with science and technology, logic and analysis, was emphasized on. But this emphasis on reason, exclusively on reason, led to materialism, commercialism, capitalism, warmongering, the First World War. So the poets there, the poets and the thinkers there could not adjust with this kind of an environment which emphasized commodification and commerce. And so these poets retreated from society into the world of art. Writers, thinkers, painters, all of them retreated from society into art. Art provided an escape from society. So all these people were alienated, full of angst, and they sought the succor that God, the idea, the belief that in God would give to them earlier, they sought it in art. Their art was escapist by nature. It emphasized a lot of innovation. There was a lot of freedom given to artists, and these artists sought to find themselves in their art, away from society. During this period, psychological novels came to be written because society had collapsed due to the loss of faith. The focus shifted to the mind of the individual. The stream of consciousness novel provided an extreme form of psychological realism. In these novels, the focus was almost entirely on the mind of the individual, the thoughts, reveries, memories, feelings, the dreams, the fancies, the hallucinations. There wasn't any plot or story in these novels. These thoughts and feelings would be organized in the form of a poem, virtually, in a lyrical form. And that was what these novels were about. Indian writers who were looking for a method in which to express the doubts and the confusions in their minds took up this mode. They adapted it to meet their needs, their requirements. And that is how such novels got to be written. Dhurjiti Prasad's Antahashila was very, very radical in form, structure and content. In this novel, one finds a lot of echoes of James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. The writer also refers to Joyce's Ulysses. What I shall do now is to give you a brief overview of each one of these 6 novels in an attempt to show how these writers were looking at the issue of modernity and individualism. How, even while adapting the Western influence, they brought in Indian traditions and came up with a brand of modernity which is very different from Western modernism. In Antahashila, Khagen Babu is a middle-aged man. The narrative begins with his wife's death. She has committed suicide. In the first part of the narrative, Khagen Babu, who cannot think very sympathetically about his wife, keeps thinking about all the contemporary issues like education and freedom and women's rights and urban life and science, social service, etc. His mind is full of thoughts, reasoning, analysis. He calls himself a very modern man. He is an intellectual. He has read everything almost, right from the Greek times to the present. He has read so much about art and literature and philosophy from all over the world, including India. So the first part of the novel shows him to be a very intellectual man, consciously thinking about intellectual issues and striving to attain freedom and wholeness in life. And yet, even as he is thinking about this, his subconscious inclinations keep drawing his attention towards women, towards food, towards rest. So there is this conflict between the conscious and the subconscious mind. Carried away by such thoughts, he discusses these issues with Romola, Sujan, Vijan, his wife's friend. But then he is frightened by Romola's growing influence upon him, and in order to preserve his independence, his individual freedom, he escapes to Kashi. In Kashi, however, he realizes that he cannot forget Romola, and more than that, he realizes that this conflict in his mind between the intellect and the body, between the reason and the desire and nature, is not giving him any peace of mind. So he writes several letters to Romola in which he expresses his plight, his terrible condition, his growing desires. And then he adds to these letters a body of notes. These notes are his private confessions about his own follies, his own weaknesses, his own dreams. He sends these notes to Romola, and then he invites Romola to come and join him as a companion. Now, even as there are several affinities between this novel and Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, there are several departures. Khagen Babu, like Stephen in A Portrait, loves beauty, loves women, loves to be loved, wants to have more and more knowledge, wants to know more about himself, and wants to create something. He also rebels. He is basically a rebel, and he will not accept society as it is. These are the similarities. Both these protagonists or heroes, Khagen Babu and Stephen, they follow similar paths, but the outcome in Khagen Babu's case is very, very different. Khagen Babu loves beauty, but his concept of beauty is much wider than Stephen's concept. He loves art, but his concept of art is much wider than Stephen's concept of art. To Stephen, the red rose symbolizes beauty, but to Khagen Babu, the druid in the forest, the bushes, the flowers growing on the heads of the bushes, the old woman in Benares, these objects that are not necessarily beautiful aesthetically, Khagen Babu is drawn towards them because he is drawn to the relevance of the object to life rather than its mere beauty. So his concept of beauty far transcends Stephen's concept. To Stephen, art is an escape from life. He would escape to Paris to create an art in which he would find the conscience of his race. To Khagen Babu, art is a way of engaging with life. Stephen's ideas of art come from Greek and Latin thinkers. That's from European thinkers. But to Khagen Babu, his concepts come from Greek and Latin and African and Indian and Japanese and Chinese cultures. His is a cosmopolitan worldview. So his concept of art is far wider. He thinks of Renaissance paintings, he thinks of Gautam Buddha's paintings in the Ajanta caves, he thinks of Indian music and Western music, and he thinks of the basic principles underlying all these great works of art. And these are the principles of simultaneity and harmony and parallelism and counterpoint. Stephen wants to create an art piece in which he will escape from nature. Khagen Babu wants to apply his artistic talents to his own life, to bring to his life the fullness of art, the balance of art, the harmony of art. So he decides he will apply these qualities to his own natural instincts. He will lay them all out before him, all his good points and his bad points. And he will harmonize and balance them. He will not repress his instincts. Let me tell you here, the modern Western ideal of art and life was very, very repressive. Emphasizing reason, the modern Western mind repressed nature. Nature in the form of passions, in the form of feelings, in the form of bodily desires, in the form of woman. Stephen loves a girl, a young lady, but he refuses to submit to her. In his ego, he refuses to even contact her. Whereas Khagen Babu confesses his love to Romola. In Antahashila, the idea of woman undergoes a very major change. At the beginning of the novel, Khagen Babu's wife has committed suicide. Because at the beginning of the novel, Khagen Babu is like a Western idealist who hates woman and body. Unable to tolerate him, his wife commits suicide. But at the end of the novel, Khagen Babu confesses to Romola that he loves her, that she has revived his dying instincts, his desires, and that he is her creation. So in this way, this narrative subverts many of the positions in Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Stephen's view of history is restricted to Ireland, where he belongs. He hates the British and he wants freedom for Ireland, but he will not surrender himself to working for Ireland. Khagen Babu too belongs to India, which was ruled by the British. But his idea of history is universal. It begins with the Greeks, comes down through the Latins and the Arabians to Western Europe, to Russia, to India. And he says, I am a product of the entire world history. I am a product of all the cultures that have shaped me. And I want to blossom as such. This cosmopolitan attitude is missing in Stephen. At the end of the narrative, Khagen Babu moves towards social service. He says, to alienate yourself from society is to maim yourself. You cannot be a complete man unless you take society along with you. You become so independent and holistic in your thought that you don't have to run away from anything. This was Khagen Babu's and Dhurjiti Prasad's idea of modernity, Indian modernity. We move next to the Hindi novel Shekhar Ek Jeevani by Ageya. This was written in 1941. Ageya's novel too shares several similarities with Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist, and yet makes radical departures as well. Like the little Stephen, Shekhar, the protagonist, is a little boy. But then here the protagonist is split into two, the commentator Shekhar and the child Shekhar. This novel was written when Ageya was in jail for one night. He was caught by the British on charges of sedition, and he feared that he would be put to death the next morning. The novel records all his memories, all his thoughts and reflections on that dreadful night. Like Stephen, Shekhar is very intelligent. The little Shekhar is very intelligent, loves love, loves women, loves beauty, composes poetry, thinks about his origins, and is a rebel. The qualities are the same. Both of them go to school, both of them leave school, both of them suffer as adolescents the desires of adolescence. Both of them are guilty, both of them go to college, but that is all. Shekhar's life is totally different from Stephen's otherwise. Shekhar's love is far more passionate, far more self-sacrificing than Stephen's. He is ready to do anything for the woman he loves, and he falls in love with every woman he comes across, including his sisters. Stephen does not have this capacity for love. Stephen loves the green rose, the symbol of an artificial form of art, an escapist form of art. The little Shekhar also loves lotuses. He has spent his childhood in Kashmir collecting lotuses from the Dal Lake, adorning his sister with garlands made of these lotuses. But then he comes to realize that such beauty is not enough. He finds the beauties in the trotting horses, in the deer, in the lakes, in the forests, in the sky, in the rivers. But he finally discovers that beauty lies in service. That is the true beauty, because a lotus will not survive in the heat of Madras. So he gives up this notion of, this elitist notion of aesthetic beauty. Stephen wonders about his place on earth. Shekhar too wonders how he was born, how the eggs appear in the nests. And he determines to find an answer. Going far ahead of Stephen, he comes to realize that he was born of his mother's womb, but then beyond that he doesn't know how he came. Stephen rebels against his peers. Shekhar too rebels against his peers. He gives up schooling. He would learn his way from the experiences of the world. But then Shekhar discovers that he will not live for art. He wouldn't be an artist. He would serve the poor. He would serve the marginalized. He would serve society. So he sacrifices art to life, just as Khagen Babu had done. He does not produce any theory of art as such, unlike Shekhar. And yet his novel, this narrative, does carry a theory. The theory that the individual alone The individual's interpretation of the world alone cannot be the ultimate truth. Truth is always multidimensional. The elder Shekhar comments upon the little Shekhar's memories, speaks about the society of the times, the social evils of the times, the rebellions of the times, and all this comes into the novel, which therefore becomes a very different novel from Joyce's A Portrait. Shekhar goes ahead of Stephen in declaring that he would not marry. He loves women so dearly, so passionately, but he discovers that marriage means an outrage on women. Marriage means hostility or some kind of cruelty towards women. He decides not to marry. He decides he would love all mankind rather than any one or two persons. And he would surrender himself to the service of women, the service of the untouchables, the service of mankind. Once again, Shekhar's positions subvert those of Stephen. And the novel, Shekhar Ek Jeevani, becomes a huge parody of Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a young man. Raja Rao's The Serpent and the Rope, published in 1960, is a different variety of novel. He does not adapt directly from any one of these stream of consciousness novels, though he refers at a point to Virginia Woolf. But he adapts the narrative patterns of these novels. Ramaswamy, or Rama, the protagonist in this novel, is a Brahmin, a South Indian Brahmin, an Orthodox Brahmin married to a French wife. His life is divided between India, that's between Benares and Paris. Part of the time he is in Benares, in southern India, the rest of the time he is in Paris, and that's how the novel continues. In the entire narrative, Rama compares and contrasts the Western view of man, the Western view of the individual, the Western view of the self, with the traditional Vedantic Indian view of man and of the self. He comes to the conclusion that the mind can be no adequate representative of man. The mind is very narrow, full of conflicts, full of confusion, full of doubt, full of agonies. Rather than the mind, it is the consciousness where the individual can truly come into his own, become the full-fledged man. And in the entire narrative, he probes the nature of consciousness versus the nature of the mind. So the Western view of life, Western modernism and Indian modernity, are compared and contrasted through and through in this narrative. It is the Brahmanical consciousness that Rama talks about, the Brahmanical view of time and space, the Brahmanical view of reality, the Brahmanical view of truth, so different from the Western. Raja Rao followed Paul Valéry's concept of, the dramatic monologue. This is dramatic monologue rather than interior monologue, where there's a high mimetic idealism. There is realism here, but it is of a high mimetic type, unlike Joyce's Ulysses, where the mimesis is of the low type, because here in Ulysses you have characters like Stephen and Bloom and Molly who are, very ordinary folk, and much of their thought is very vulgar. So unlike them, in fact he parodies them, And he writes about, that is, Raja Rao writes about the life of Ramaswamy, who is a very noble person, learned in the Vedantas, though he has his follies, though he has his flaws. So in The Serpent and the Rope, you have a different kind of the stream of consciousness novel, a different interpretation of the Indian individual. Individualism is here, definitely. Individualism is to be achieved, is to be sought after, but it is not narcissistic individualism. It is not the individualism that is lost in loving itself. It is not the individualism of a Hamlet or a Stephen. It is a trans-subjective individualism where the individual transcends the ordinary parameters of the common everyday life. He moves into the higher regions of the consciousness where the self-other divide is lost. So this too parodies Western stream of consciousness narrative mode in a big way. In fact, Rao assimilated the form of the Purana, the traditional Indian Purana, with features of the stream of consciousness narrative mode. This was a radical innovation. We move on to the female novelists. These novelists took their inspiration from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. The heroines or the protagonists in these two novels, Mahashweta Devi's Baish Kupit Baksho and Anita Desai's Cry the Peacock. The heroines in these two novels resemble Virginia Woolf's protagonists, Clarissa and Mrs. Ramsay, in a big way. Shelley Marshi of Baish Kupit Baksho is as regal in her carriage as Clarissa and Mrs. Ramsay. They are almost of the same age. They have great qualities of art, great artistic talent, sewing and knitting and things like that. They love the people around them. As in Mrs. Dalloway and Mrs. Ramsay, in these narratives too, there is a get-together, there is a party, where the private lives, the secret inner agonies of the heroines surface through interior monologue. In each one of these get-togethers, there's a private dialogue, subterranean dialogue between the heroine and her lover or her husband. These parties, these dinner parties or get-togethers, they bring the larger society into play, and so many relationships, so many stories, so many hidden secret desires surface. Thus there are many similarities in these Indian novels and Virginia Woolf's novels, and yet the differences are as radical. After each one of the get-together, the protagonists suffered a deep sense of gloom and despair. Clarissa and Mrs. Ramsay yearned for suicide and for death. But in Baish Kupit Baksho, Shelley Marshi is rescued from this by Debashish. She too had been in tremendous despair after the get-together, because the get-together did not reveal to her the secret, the truth of the secrets that she had wanted to know. The truth why she was deserted by Kapil. The truth why Nellie went out and died in the street. She was in despair, but it is Debashish who comes and who tells her to look at things in the world from God's point of view, with detachment and passive surrender. He talks about the negative capability, Keats's negative capability, which Khagen Babu talks about in Antarshila, which Shekhar talks about in Ageya's Shekharik Jivani. All of them talk about a detachment from the ordinary run of life, detachment from the attachment, from the connections which cause you so much pain. So in this way, despite all the similarities between Vaishkupit Baksho and Woolf's novels, Shelley Marshi acquires a sense of peace, comes to acquire a sense of passive resignation, surrender. And with this attitude, which has been instilled in her by Debashish, the character, who is a painter, who is a teacher, who has suffered so much, but who has given up all his attachment and has moved towards the ashram. He has taught her how to look at life from God's perspective, look at it from a distance. With this attitude, she looks at the photographs that are there in the cinematograph, and each one of the photographs brings to her mind a host of involuntary memories in which she discovers the causes that had led to the two tragedies of Kapil deserting her and Nellie dying. So this detachment helps Shelley to come by the truth. And after she has come by the truth, she discovers in herself a great peace of mind, enlarging consciousness, and she discovers that all those people whom she had been missing, like Nellie and her aunts and her uncles and her parents and grandmother, etc., they are all there in her, within her consciousness as part of herself. They are never to desert her ever. So with a great sense of peace, she keeps the cinematograph away. She has no more need for memories. This is a major step in Indian stream of consciousness fiction. These novels are novels of memory, but in this novel, Mahashweta Devi has shown that memory is finally not necessary. You must give memory up, like Debashish has given it up, to come into the freedom of the consciousness. So this novel too parodies Woolf's novels in a major way. In Mannu Bhandari's Aapka Bunty, the story is of the little boy, 9-year-old boy Bunty, who resembles Stephen in all character traits. He is bold, he is intelligent, he is an artist, he loves to imagine things, he loves to be loved, he loves beauty, he loves women, everything. And yet, the reality of the times is so horrendous, is so difficult, that Bunty is stripped of all his talents one by one. Stephen has a lot of support from his father, from his family. Bunty discovers that his parents are going in for a divorce. Stephen goes to school. Bunty has to leave school because his mother has married elsewhere. He has lost his balance of mind. His father comes to take him away, and there he is unable to master his intellect. And this intelligent boy cannot answer simple questions that the teacher at the new school asks. So his father decides to put him up in a hostel. So Bunty's story is one of losing homes, increasing rootlessness from one home to another. Stephen trusts Daedalus, the myth of Daedalus, the Greek legendary hero who had devised artificial wings to escape to freedom from the nets that his own mind had created. And Stephen invokes the blessings of Daedalus while he is trying to escape his own country. Bunty had a gun. His father had gifted him with this gun. With this gun, he would express his protest at whatever his mother was doing when she went ahead with another man, when she took him into another family. He would shoot his air gun violently into the air. And he wonders whose toy he is. Stephen has Daedalus for himself, his foster father. But he asks himself, am I my mother's toy or my father's toy? To whom do I belong? Stephen composes poetry. Bunty does his paintings. But when he goes to his father's house, when he is being taken away by his father, the paint and the brush and the canvas, the drawing books, everything is left behind. So here is a case of systematic inversion which Manu Bhandari uses to showcase the plight of a child in a broken family. Manu Bhandari's message is clear. She did not subscribe to the philosophy of art for art's sake, which was the philosophy of Virginia Woolf and Joyce and the others. She was using her art like a gear to project the reality of life, the social reality of life. So she moves away from the literary premises of the stream of consciousness narrative mode. In Cry the Peacock, Maya shares qualities which are similar to Mrs. Ramsay's and Mrs. Dalloway's. Like them, she loves nature. She loves life. She's not an intellectual type. She loves children. She doesn't have any, so she loves her pet. The story is that in her childhood, she had been a motherless girl and she had been taken to meet an astrologer, an albino astrologer who had predicted very terrible things for herself. This had had a deep negative impact upon her mind, so much so that her father restricted her moving out of the house. She lives virtually in confinement, without any friends, without any servants, without any relatives, all alone. And then she is married off to a man who is almost her father's age. And in his family, once again, she is alone. Because his family, his mother and father, they live elsewhere in Kolkata. So once again, she is alone. And then the memory of whatever the astrologer had said rises in her to unsettle her. The astrologer had predicted that in the 4th year of their marriage, one of the spouses would have an unnatural death. And Maya, the young girl bride who loves life so much, is caught in the obsession of who is going to die. Is it her husband Gautam who will die, or is it she that will die? This obsession continues to mount, and there's no one she can share it with. There's no one to support her. There's no one to tell her that the astrologer's predictions need not be true, because her father, her friends, they are all fatalists. They believe in fate. And her husband is a total agnostic. He doesn't believe in fate at all. He will not listen to Maya. So she is all alone, and the fear and the obsession, they keep growing on her. And they drive her to madness. Now here again, Maya's growing madness resembles that of Septimus Smith in Mrs. Dalloway. Septimus Smith had been rendered mad because of his experiences in the First World War. The historical background. Maya is rendered mad because of her own experiences with two historical forces in her life. One, the feudal life of her father, the medieval life of her father, full of luxury, full of superstition, full of ignorance. On the one hand, it was this, and on the other hand, it was the life of her husband, the views of her husband, who was an intellectual, who was a Marxist. And Maya is enmeshed between the two. Nobody understands her plight, the plight of the individual woman in an Indian family. Her madness grows like Septimus Smith's madness grows. And Septimus finally jumps out of the window and kills himself in order to escape being taken away by the psychiatrist. And when he does so, his wife goes mad. In Maya's case, Maya pushes Gautama from the terrace so that he dies. She has grown schizoid and she thinks that let Gautama die, he is anyway very old. He doesn't enjoy life as much as I do. What right has he to live? So Maya is mad and Gautama is dead. And yet there's a huge change brought in by Anita Desai into this novel. And this change is in the form of Gautama's mother, Maya's mother-in-law. The old woman who is a social servant. She spends all her time knitting sweaters for the destitutes. She runs an orphanage. At this point, when her own son has been killed, she takes charge of the child bride Maya. In full compassion, she protects her. Knowing that some experience must have gone terribly wrong with the girl, she refuses to blame the girl. Once again, in this old lady, you see an instance of individualism, individual thought. But what kind of an individualism? It is a trans-subjective individualism, where the individual doesn't restrict her interest to herself. She transcends the mind into the realm of the consciousness, where self and world merge, and she takes charge of the girl Maya. A character like Gautama's mother is missing in Woolf's novels. So thus we see that in each one of these novels, the central issue is individualism. But the issue of the individual is mediated by Indian tradition, which does not segregate between the self and the other. The Vedanta proclaims that the self alone is one, the individual alone is one, but then this oneness absorbs the whole world into it. There is no escapism from society in any one of these novels. Each one of these individuals, each one of these novelists engages with society in a meaningful manner. Art here becomes a means of enriching life, of understanding the world, of bringing society closer. Art is not an escape. This new view of self and reality appearing in these novels brings radical changes in narrative form in each one of these novels. It brings changes in the nature of the motifs, the nature of the symbols, the nature of the imagery used here, such that in these novels you find a new aesthetic, the rise of a new aesthetic, the aesthetic of tradition in the modern novel. So in these novels you have the rise of the modern Indian novel. And therefore, I would recommend that in order to understand these issues more deeply, you look up this book that I have brought out, A Dynamic Modernity. Thank you.